Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no.
Amateur Traveler, episode 621. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about sports teams and Andy Warhol, the French and Indian War, caverns, oil wells, and steel as we go to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. With no further ado, let's talk about Pittsburgh. I'd like to welcome to the show Tom Shaner from the Pittsburgh area, who has come to talk to us about the same. Tom, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Chris. Looking forward to sharing the Pittsburgh area with all your listeners.
Great. And now we have done another show on Pittsburgh, just so people know, if you've been around for a long, long time. We did an episode about, episode 259, so about the 6th year of the show, so about 7-8 years ago. But why should people go to Pittsburgh?
Why should people go to Pittsburgh? There's an immeasurable amount of things to do here, both in the city, outdoors activities, culture, history. There's been somewhat of an arts renaissance here. Since the collapse of the steel industry back in the 70s and 80s, this area was somewhat downtrodden for quite some time, but we've had a renaissance as far as not only a new building, it's become a technology center, it's become a healthcare center, it's a college and university town. There's a lot going on here.
Well, and I think people of my age, which is less than half the audience these days, will picture Pittsburgh and they'll think of that town that was driven by coal and steel and was a little dirty back in the day. But that's not the Pittsburgh that it is today.
It is not. I live a little bit outside of the city, and the Kiskiminitis River, what we refer to it as the Kiski, and I live real close to it. It flows into the Allegheny, which then flows down into the city, was bright orange when I was a little kid.
Oh, my gosh.
And there was no living things living in the river. Now it's popular for kayaking, canoeing, fishing. There's some great trails along it. I was actually going to talk about that a little later as far as the outdoor stuff goes, but that's an example of how it's really changed. We don't have the air quality alerts like we did when I was a little kid either.
Excellent. What kind of itinerary do you recommend for people who are coming to Pittsburgh?
I would ideally say come in and stay downtown.
Okay.
I wouldn't have said that even probably as the time of your last podcast.
Okay.
It's really, really changed downtown Pittsburgh. Downtown Pittsburgh was a place that would shutter its doors at 5 o'clock on weekdays and nothing would be on the weekends. Now there is what was formerly the, I don't want to call it a red light district, but where there was a lot of unsavory stuff going on in one street, is now close to what we have a theater district with lots of shows and things going on every night, from Broadway type shows to symphony to ballet to plays. There are lots of restaurants now downtown. There are people living downtown. They're building a lot of condos and stuff. So there's people downtown at all hours now.
Now, is downtown a specific neighborhood, or are there a couple different neighborhoods that you mean when you say downtown?
Downtown is a specific neighborhood. It would be the Triangle.
Okay.
It's at Point State Park, which is where the rivers meet.
And when we say the rivers, the Allegheny and the
Allegheny and the Monongahela.
Monongahela form the Ohio. Okay. I could not come up with Monongahela. I don't know why. It rolls right off the tongue.
It is the triangular portion there where all of the skyscrapers and larger buildings is considered the downtown area.
Okay. And so you say stay downtown, and I'm staying in a boutique hotel. I'm getting an Airbnb.
There's a number of hotels. That used to be an issue too. There weren't that many hotels downtown, and they were sometimes hard to get, especially during the week, because they would be occupied by business travelers. Now there are more hotels. Downtown itself is quite walkable. And the center of it, right up from Point State Park, is a place called Market Square.
Okay.
And Market Square is surrounded there by some restaurants. There is, every Saturday night, they have a little festival type thing with a band playing. In the wintertime, there's a Christmas market there. There's a farmer's market someday during the week there. And there's usually something always going on at lunchtime, activity-wise, for the people walking around. So that's a nice place to start.
Okay.
The PPG Place, which is a very large castle-looking glass building, is to the one side of it. And there is, in the summertime, a water fountain there that kids can run through, although they don't like people coming in bathing suits. There's actually a sign prohibiting that, but they don't care how wet you get.
I don't understand that rule, but okay.
I actually asked the security guard about that one time, and they actually said it was because they wanted to keep it in a business atmosphere. Those buildings are office buildings for law firms, banking, et cetera.
Okay.
And in the wintertime, there is an ice rink, which is somewhat reminiscent of like Rockefeller Centers in New York City. The Point State Park, like I first mentioned, we have a regatta in the summertime in July on the rivers. So they'll put tents up and have various vendors and bands and a lot go on there, as well as there's the Fort Pitt Museum there, which has to do with the Fort Pitt from the French and Indian War.
Okay.
Fort Duquesne. I think that was discussed at length in your previous podcast, actually very well, I thought.
It's been so long ago, I don't remember. I'll have to.
I listened to it not that long ago. And there's a lot of good restaurants downtown now. And the people watching is great.
Well, I won't have you recommend specific people to watch, but did you have specific restaurants you wanted to recommend?
Downtown, there's a place it's actually in the theater district. It's called Meat and Potatoes.
I think I can guess what type of cuisine that might be.
Yeah, it's kind of self-explanatory. It's steaks. They're really well known for their bone marrow. I haven't had that there, but I've had the sandwich. I've had some burgers there, and I've had a steak there, which is very good.
Okay.
There is also in the Market Square is the original Oyster House. While it's not one of my favorite restaurants, it is interesting in the fact that it's the oldest restaurant in Pittsburgh. It's been there for 150 years as the original Oyster House. Huh. There's another place called Wing Hearts in Market Square that has burgers and wings, chicken wings. We're sort of close to Buffalo, so we're a big chicken wing area. It's only about 4 hours away. Back to Point State Park, there's also the fountain at the end of the park, which is quite nice. They don't let you swim in it or wade in it, but you can dip your feet in it and watch all the boats go by.
Okay. I'm looking over across the way now at the new baseball stadium when I'm sitting there.
That's where I'm going to go next. That's the north side.
Okay.
The north side of Pittsburgh is formerly the city of Allegheny.
Okay.
Until the early 20th century, and it was annexed by the city of Pittsburgh. If you're looking across there, you see Heinz Field, which is the football stadium, and then down a little bit upriver, up the Allegheny, you'll see PNC Park, which is where the Pittsburgh Pirates play. And there's a whole bunch of new restaurants and hotels. That would actually be also a decent place to stay there on the North Shore at one of the hotels there. The subway runs from the North Shore to downtown. We have somewhat of a limited subway. That it's free, though, from the north side to downtown.
Oh, okay.
And then it goes into the south, which is more residential. There's not a whole lot of touristy things to do in the south. And in any event, we actually had a train derailment last week that fell onto the tracks of the light rail.
Oh, my.
Regular train. And it's not to be cleaned up, I think, for another 2 or 3 weeks, they're saying right now. So you wouldn't want to use that anyway, at least in the short term. So,
well, and for people who are listening further in the field, let's put a date on this. We are currently recording this in mid-August of 2018. So if you're hearing in a year that doesn't end with 2018, we're probably okay.
Yes. In the North Shore, there is a whole lot of stuff to do. And this is referred to as the North Side. And the North Side can be broken up into various little neighborhoods.
Okay.
Although most the locals all refer to it as the North Side. There is the North Shore, which is that area where the stadiums are, and then there's a whole bunch of restaurants. One restaurant I would particularly recommend there is the Jerome Bettis 36 Grill.
And who is Jerome Bettis?
Jerome Bettis was a running back for the Pittsburgh Steelers. 36 was the number that he wore on his uniform.
Okay.
It's burgers, sandwiches, some steaks. General plain American food, but it's done very, very well. And it's got a very Pittsburghy atmosphere. It's kind of an interesting place. And it's right next to the water. And you can sit outside there too. I've always really enjoyed it. And I've never had a bad meal.
What is a Pittsburghy atmosphere?
Pittsburghy atmosphere would be people watching and listening to people talk. There is Pittsburghese. We kind of have our own dialect here.
Okay.
That people sometimes make fun of at other places. Instead of you or you all or y'all as in the South, we say yins.
Okay.
We'll say the car needs washed. We won't say the car needs to be washed.
Okay.
And we say things like downtown, and we have, instead of downtown, and slippy instead of slippery, gum band instead of rubber band. There's a whole little language going on. Actually, a great thing to do if people want to check out what Pittsburghers sound like is go to YouTube and YouTube Pittsburgh Dad.
Okay.
Would probably be the easiest way to do that. Some people have quite the funny accent. Watching people and the people are nuts about the Pittsburgh Steelers here.
Okay.
That is part of the Pittsburghy part too. Is it's not just during Pittsburgh season. Everybody wears Steeler stuff all year round. It's just kind of fun that way. And a little further into the north side, but still in the North Shore area, is the Andy Warhol Museum.
Okay. Let's take a break here and hear from our sponsor. This episode of Amateur Traveler is sponsored by Vivid Seats. Vivid Seats is an online event ticket marketplace. Whether you're traveling across the globe or across town, Vivid Seats can help you get tickets to a local concert, show, or sporting event. If you're going to New York, get tickets to a Broadway show. Have plans to visit Chicago, see historic Wrigley Field. Wherever your travels take you, Vivid Seats can help you fill up your itinerary with experiences you'll remember long after you return home. And just for listeners of Amateur Traveler, you can get 10% off your first ticket purchase at Vivid Seats using the promo code TRAVEL. That's it, just travel. So as you plan your next adventure, go to vividseats.com or download the app and enter the promo code TRAVEL to save 10% on your first order, whether it's a concert, theater, or sporting event. This offer is good to the end of August 2018, and thanks to Vivid Seats for sponsoring Amateur Traveler.
There's a lot of arts stuff in the North Shore. And then if you proceed into the north side, but on the eastern end of it would be what's called Deutschtown.
Okay.
Which was originally, as you can tell from Deutschtown, it was originally German.
Mm-hmm.
Max's Allegheny Tavern is a good restaurant. It is German food. There's also an interesting little museum there called Photo Antiquities.
Okay.
It is a very small museum, but it's fascinating. It has to deal with the process of photography as well as the history of photography. They start with daguerreotypes and show you the different types of photographs from the history of photography. And it's quite fascinating. It's something that probably only take an hour. but it's quite a fascinating little museum.
Speaking of museums, you mentioned the Warhol Museum, but you didn't say anything about it.
Okay. Yes. And the Warhol Museum, Warhol meaning Andy Warhol, the pop artist. He was famous for his Campbell soup cans
Right.
and his photo art of celebrities where they'd show like 4 different images in different colors. And I think particular ones like Marilyn Monroe is the one that he did that rings a bell with me. But
That's
it's
the one I
several
thought of.
stories tall and a number of rooms. It's quite an interesting museum.
And Pittsburgh because it's his hometown.
Yes, it is his hometown. Yes. And I believe they just had a big 90th birthday party for him last week, even though he is no longer with us.
Oh, you scared me there for a second. I was thinking he was no longer. What? Okay. And this is, I guess, the largest collection of his works. I didn't remember that was there.
I do believe it is the largest collection of his works. Obviously, there are a number of his works in other art museums around the country.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you go slightly to the west of there's a place called Randyland that I absolutely love. It's good for a small stop, too. It's kind of hard to describe in that it's owned by Randy Gilson, and he bought this property 20 or 30 years ago on a credit card. And it was in an area called the Mexican War Streets, kind of somewhat run down. And he has fixed it up, and he's helped revitalize this entire neighborhood.
The Mexican War Streets. So streets named after famous people from the Mexican War?
Battles, I believe.
Okay.
It's like Vista Street, Palo Alto Street, places where there were battles in the Mexican War in the 1840s, I believe that was.
Mm-hmm.
But Randyland is very brightly. He's painted the outside of the buildings, and it's basically a courtyard that is super brightly painted and with a lot of basically repurposed junk. It's constantly evolving and constantly changing. It's a free attraction. It's interesting. It's very very hard to describe, and he's quite a character. It's almost like my happy place in the town. It makes me smile every time I go there. People are always smiling. Again, another place to people watch because you get to see these people seeing it for the first time, and they're just always smiling, and everything's hands-on, and the kids can come in there and play with. He's got a big sandbox area in the middle with plastic rats and other little toys. And there was a bowling ball the kids were playing with last time I was there. And there's lawn furniture, and he's got welcome painted in I don't know how many languages all over the outside of the place, probably 30, 40 or more languages. And it's really, really an interesting place.
And among the most Instagrammed places I see, which
yes.
I get that seeing the pictures of it. Okay.
Yeah, you can see from the pictures then it's kind of hard to describe, but it's well worth a stop if you're in the city. A couple blocks away from there is a place called the Mattress Factory, which I think it used to be a mattress factory at one time, but it's now an art gallery of room-sized art exhibits from various artists, none of which spring to my mind on who they are, but it's a very interesting place as well. It's in several buildings on a block, and you go through it from art installation to art installation. It's all quite modern type art.
Okay.
And it's quite an interesting place as well. There's a Pittsburgh institution nearby in the Allegheny West Park, which is just towards downtown from the Mattress Factory. It's a place called Gus and Yaya's.
Okay.
It's a food cart, and it's been there for years.
Yep.
Except they call him the Icy Ball Man. It's sort of like Hawaiian shave ice. And it's a Pittsburgh institution in this park in the summertime. It's worth a short visit. Plus, the icy balls are very good.
Okay.
Then I would go slightly further west, but I wouldn't advise walking to it. I would advise either driving or taking a quick Uber because it's in an industrial area and you would have to cross a highway.
Okay.
There's 2 museums down there that are worth a stop. One is called Bicycle Heaven.
Okay.
It's the world's largest bicycle museum.
Okay.
And it's also a working bike shop. And it's quite fascinating. They have bikes there bikes were invented apparently back in the early 1800s till now.
The first bike was invented 200 years ago last year. 2017. It was invented in Mannheim, Germany. It had no pedals.
Huh.
It was a running machine, and it looked like the same, except it had two wheels and things, but it was made out of wood. And by carriage rights, basically, and you ran, and and that was how you provided the transportation.
Huh.
I happened to be on a press trip last year celebrating the 200th anniversary of the bicycle, so
that's very interesting.
they're fascinating. And then you get the great big wheel in the front, which seemed like a really bad idea because they didn't invent chains for a while. So once you start pedaling, you're first pedaling this great big wheel, and then they go back to more like the original design, which is more like what we're familiar with. And those are called safety bikes because you don't fall off and die as much as you do with those great big wheeled bicycles.
I believe there might actually be some pedalless bikes in the museum.
Oh, that's great.
And it's also a free museum. It's a free attraction. And there's a museum next door to it called Johnny Angel's Museum of Ginchy Things, I believe, or Ginchy Place. Johnny Angel was a Pittsburgh area musician, and he decided to share his personal record and music memorabilia collection because he's met people from the musical industry nationwide and just decided to share it. And he's often there. He's an interesting gentleman as well. And it's just an interesting little museum. Also, I believe it's free next to Bicycle Heaven, immediately next door to Bicycle Heaven.
Okay, and I had to look up Ginchy. I had no idea what you were talking about. Apparently, it's an adjective that means, fairly dated adjective, means sexy or cool.
Okay, that would make sense.
From the context, I figured it was something like that. But
from the context and musician, he's mostly an oldies musician these days. When he started out, it was the 1960s. That's the music that he plays, basically 60s rock and roll.
Okay.
I would like to jump back to Deutschtown because I forgot to mention the Children's Museum, which is quite nice, but it's particularly the National Aviary.
Okay.
The National Aviary is basically a zoo, but is obviously just birds.
Huh.
And it's quite fascinating. They have everything from a great penguin exhibit. They have California condor exhibit, and then rooms in indoor jungle with various jungle birds, and another one with songbirds. It's quite fascinating and an interesting place to go.
A condor exhibit seems like it would have to be fairly large.
It's fairly large. It's actually outside. Most of their exhibits are inside. The penguins is half inside and half outside. The condor exhibit is all outside in these huge pens on the outside of the building.
Interesting.
Now, I'm going to move on to briefly some views of the city.
Okay.
The south side, and there's Mount Washington. Mount Washington is a hillside that sits across the Monongahela and Ohio, where it meets the Ohio on the south side of the city. And there are two funiculars, I believe they're called, but we call them inclines.
Okay.
It's a Duquesne incline and the Monongahela incline. And quite a nice thing to do is to take a ride up one of them, walk down the street to the other one. I don't know the distance, probably a half mile or a mile. It's a nice walk. There's Grandview Park up there, which is all along the whole thing. And there's a number of restaurants. There's also a street called Shiloh Street up there that has a number of restaurants and small shops.
Okay.
So there's beautiful view. If you see a lot of view from up that look down on downtown Pittsburgh, that's where a lot of those shots are come from, the park up there.
Got it. Okay.
There is a lesser known view of the downtown on the west end. You take the West End Bridge, but it goes from like basically the edge of the north side over to the west end, which is across the Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a park up there, and it's part of the town called Elliott, it's called the West End Overlook. And that's a view that a lot of tourists don't get, and I think it's just as stunning, but it looks more at the point from straight on.
Mm-hmm.
It's quite a nice view as well. And if you go back to downtown, but we head up the Allegheny River, there's the Strip District. And the Strip District is an area that used to be the market. It still somewhat is, where the produce comes into town. And there's meat markets and fish markets. It's quite a good place to go on, particularly Saturday mornings. There's a lot of shops and vendors. It's quite touristy as well.
Mm-hmm.
Pittsburgh tourist items, along with quite a few restaurants. There's a breakfast restaurant called DeLuca's there. It's quite good. There's a newer restaurant called Gaucho Paria, which is excellent. It's actually an Argentinian steakhouse.
Okay. I was going to guess steak when she said gaucho, but
Everything is done over a flame.
okay.
It's excellent. Further up the river is the neighborhood of Lawrenceville, and it's been quite gentrified in the last 8 years. It probably wasn't even mentioned in the last podcast because it was a very rundown neighborhood, but it seems to have become the new hipster center of Pittsburgh. There's microbreweries opening up everywhere, lots of restaurants, little shops, lots of renovations of old buildings and turning them into apartments, lofts, condos.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really, really changing that dynamic of that neighborhood quite a bit. And also in that neighborhood is the Allegheny Cemetery, which there are a couple notable graves in there. It's just a beautiful cemetery with old gravestones, mausoleum. A couple of notable people buried there are Stephen Foster and Lillian Russell, the actress.
Mm-hmm.
There's an area called Swissvale, which is along the Monongahela River, and there's an old steel mill there called the Cary Furnace, and it's across from the old Homestead Works, which where the Homestead strike was, I believe that was 1892. Andrew Carnegie's steel
Mm-hmm.
mill, and Andrew Clay Frick was the foreman or the president of the mill at the time and running it, and the workers tried to unionize, and Frick brought in Pinkerton agents,
Mm-hmm.
and there was
The strike breakers, yeah.
the Cary Furnace is directly across the river from there, and it's still standing. It's a national historical site now. And they are renovating it, and it is also sort of an art community as well. So it's an interesting mix of history and art, and you can take tours of it. You have to arrange it ahead of time, but they have tours pretty much, I think, every day, at least in the summertime. And you can either do a history tour or an art tour.
Well, and you mentioned the summertime. We haven't asked the question yet, but this seems like a good time to ask it. Best time of the year to come to Pittsburgh?
The best time of the year, I would say July through September would be our best weather.
Okay.
We're getting quite a bit of rain this year that we don't normally get this time of year. But weather-wise, I would say we get sometimes some rainy Junes, but that's still okay. The only time I would really avoid Pittsburgh would be when a lot of things are closed and not much is going on. It would be January through March. Everybody's stays indoors and there's not much going on.
Best day of the year to go to Pittsburgh?
I think any given Saturday in July or August. There are so many ethnic festivals
Okay.
going on, and a good place to check for those, believe it or not, is ohiofestivals.net.
Okay. Have a favorite festival that you would recommend?
My favorite festival is the Three Rivers Arts Festival, which is actually early June, but it's notorious for raining the whole time.
Okay.
But that's my favorite festival. I prefer the weather a little further on into the summer,
Okay.
as far as going out and seeing things. It still may rain, but you're less likely to get around. We do have a lot of rainy and overcast days here.
Okay. Where to next?
A little further outside of town in West Mifflin, PA, is Kennywood Park.
Okay.
That's an old amusement park. It is a lot of fun if you're into that sort of thing. There are some old classic roller coasters as well as the newer steel type and a lot of amusement rides. It's where everybody from Pittsburgh goes at least once a year.
Okay.
There's usually community picnics there that each community has their day. And then obviously it's very popular with tourists as well. So it's a fun day, full day.
And when you say each community has their day, do you mean like a Polish day or do you mean like a Shady Side day?
Various school districts have their days.
Got it.
Various communities like the small town outside of Pittsburgh, and they'll lump some of them together.
Mm-hmm.
I live near Apollo, Pennsylvania. They'll have Apollo Day,
Okay.
for example, or they'll have the local Kiski area school district day. They'll also have some ethnic days there as well, I do believe.
Okay.
Polish or Italian. It can be quite interesting that way. I did want to touch on day trips from Pittsburgh,
Mm-hmm.
and I wanted to stay within a 2-hour drive or so. The amount of things that you can do with using Pittsburgh as a home base. Now, obviously, you need a car at this point.
Right. Yeah, I'm guessing you don't really recommend a car when we're staying in Pittsburgh.
I don't think you really need a car while you're staying in Pittsburgh. I would have recommended it before the advent of Uber and Lyft.
Okay. Yeah.
The cab service was kind of spotty prior to that, but since Uber and Lyft have come around, Pittsburgh's really easy to get around using those services. But if you're going to go any further afield, I do recommend a car. One of the first places that I would recommend is going to Ligonier, Pennsylvania,
Okay.
which is a small town. There is an amusement park near there called Idlewild Park. It's actually affiliated with Kennywood Park, but it's a little more foresty and for the younger children. There's also Fort Ligonier, which is a reconstructed fort from the French and Indian War. And there's a couple of state parks in that area, particularly Lynn Run State Park, which I think is great for hiking. And there's also a natural water slide in the creek there.
And it's interesting. That's the second time you've brought up the French and Indian War. But of course, at that time, this was the frontier.
Yes.
So this is before the American War of Independence by, 20 years, I think, or something like that before then.
I don't know my exact dates, but I believe it started in the 1850s and ended in the 1860s.
Yeah.
Or some sort, 1750s.
Right. 1750s. It's hard to picture Pittsburgh as being out west, but it definitely used to be.
Yes, it did. And I guess another interesting fact I think about Pittsburgh is Pittsburgh is where the boats were built for the Lewis and Clark expedition.
Oh, okay, sure. That makes sense.
There is no spot, or I always thought they should have a museum or something there for that, since it's the true beginning of the expedition and not where they actually left from. I think it's St. Charles, Missouri.
Interesting. Well, and of course, this being the start of the Ohio River, especially in those early days of the U.S., this was a very, very major spot because you could get your goods to market cheaper in some ways by going west down the Ohio than you could by trying to bring them east, even though east is not as far, on old roads across the hills of central Pennsylvania.
Yeah, the Appalachian Mountains, they're not obviously like the Rockies of out west, but
right.
A lot of it, too, is the vegetation on the mountain.
Mm-hmm.
It was very hard to cut through, as well as there were some steep ravines and cliff sides to go by.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of tough road building. So the rivers were really the superhighways of the day. Absolutely.
Cool. So you took us to Fort Ligonier.
I guess I'll take you to another fort south of there. The south of there would be Ohio State Park, which is where there's some whitewater rafting and some hiking as well. And not too far from there is Fort Necessity.
Ah, okay.
Which is another, which I believe is where the French and Indian War began. George Washington built a small fort there and eventually had to surrender it to the French.
Mm-hmm. He didn't want to, but it was a necessity.
Near there also is an interesting cavern called Laurel Caverns.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And it's a little different than most of the caverns that I've been to anywhere else. There's no stalactites and stalagmites. It's all limestone and sandstone.
Mm-hmm.
It's quite fascinating to go through it. I don't want to say it's not as pretty as some of the other types of caves that have all the rock formations.
Mm-hmm.
It's a different type of rock formation. So it's still very attractive. It's a nice tour. And non-lighted tours where you have to go through it with a flashlight. But I think you need to be 12 or older for those.
Okay. And are they still large spaces, or is it more like Mammoth Cave, for instance, that's long but not so big?
It's more long but not so big.
Okay.
It's a lot of smaller chambers and tight spots to go through.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually, I believe, the largest cavern system in Pennsylvania.
Okay.
But it is, it's not these huge, massive rooms. I mean, there's some decent-sized rooms, but not those huge, massive ones like you're referring to.
Mm-hmm.
Another way to go from Pittsburgh would be to go north to Erie, Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
You've got great beaches at Presque Isle State Park, along with boat rentals, kayak rentals. There's a nice bay there with calm water.
And not surprisingly enough, I guess at this point, is we are on Lake Erie in Erie, Pennsylvania.
We are on Lake Erie. It's almost exactly 2 hours north of Pittsburgh.
Okay.
It's a beautiful place. The USS Niagara from the War of 1812 is docked there.
Okay.
That's worth seeing. And a little bit south of Erie is Pennsylvania oil country,
mm-hmm.
where oil was first discovered, I guess it was the first oil well in the U.S. prior to Texas and Oklahoma becoming the big thing.
Yeah, this is where Rockefeller makes his mark.
Yes. Drake's Well was the first well,
mm-hmm.
and there is a Drake's Well Museum and Park near Titusville, Pennsylvania that's quite interesting, where they have replicas and rebuilt it, what it looked like back then. And then there's also Oil Creek State Park nearby, which has pictures and things of where all the wells were. And then you see what it looks like now, where it's all overgrown. There's some old buildings there, but mostly it's nice hiking. And you can't really tell that a lot of this stuff was there, but it's interesting to see their rundown buildings that are still there and some of the equipment that's still there and how that's really been reclaimed by nature.
Okay.
So that area is very interesting. Another place to go to from Ohio, believe it or not, is actually closer to Cleveland, Ohio, which Cuyahoga Valley National Park is only an hour and 45 minutes from Pittsburgh, which is some beautiful waterfalls, hiking, a scenic railroad. Another way to go would be southwest of the city is Meadowcroft Rock Shelter.
Okay.
Which is a former Native American site. At one time, I don't know if it still is, it was thought to be the oldest known archaeological site for Native Americans in, I believe, all of the Americas.
But that would be hard to picture.
The archaeological site at Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, I believe, is 16,000 years old.
Oh, wow. Okay.
At one time, I don't know if there's something been discovered since, but at one time, I believe it was the oldest archaeological site in the Americas. They've found evidence of inhabitation in that area. It's not really a cave. It's more of just an overhang.
It's a rock shelter, as it were.
Yes, it is a working site. And then they also have a museum next to it. And they have 3 little villages, a replica of a 1500s Native American village that would be representative of Western Pennsylvania at the time.
Mm-hmm.
They have a 1790s replica of a village of what the Native American village at the time, and then basically a farmstead and what a little village would be like at the time. And it's quite fascinating to see the 3. And you could spend probably 3 or 4 hours between those little villages and then taking the tour of the rock shelter. It's quite fascinating.
Interesting.
And it's only about an hour from the city. And if you continue to the southwest, you can get down to Wheeling, West Virginia, and Moundsville, West Virginia. Pennsylvania sits very close to the West Virginia and Ohio borders.
Right.
So there are things to do in that direction. Moundsville is interesting, and right in the middle of the town is a Native American mound.
Okay.
With a museum, and you can climb the mound and look out over the town and also look out over the former West Virginia State Penitentiary.
Okay.
Which is this huge, imposing prison.
Mm-hmm.
It's no longer in operation that you can do tours of. I have done the tour. There's a sign there that's always intrigued me. There's a sign on it that says mock prison riots. and I always wanted to go, for some reason, wanted to go see a mock prison riot.
I've never heard of such a thing. Interesting. Okay.
But I don't know what those hours of operation are for those, if they only do that a certain time of year or that. There's also ghost tours of the prison if you're into that sort of thing as well.
Excellent. Well, we're getting a little further afield here. I'm going to start to wind you up. Anything else you wanted to cover before we do?
I think I've covered most of the major. There's some smaller things like various parks around Pittsburgh. There's a lot of hiking around Pittsburgh.
Yeah, we didn't say, you sort of implied it from the Mount Washington, but we're not in a flat area of the country.
We are not. Pittsburgh is very hilly. Unlike a lot of towns that are cities that are just a sprawl, Pittsburgh is divided up into a lot of smaller neighborhoods and small towns due to the topography, because each little ravine has its town. And Pittsburgh is very hilly and also has a lot of rivers and streams. It has the 3 rivers, but there's also rivers that flow into those rivers, and then there's streams that flow into those rivers that all break up various communities. It is a city of bridges.
Okay.
I believe we have the most bridges in the United States, if not the world.
The world would be hard. I think that would be tough to beat Amsterdam or one of those cities. But
Amsterdam or Venice.
Yeah.
Although I believe we may. Although we're not a canal type city like some of those.
Exactly.
There's also, I do know this, steepest street in the world, supposedly, and it's not far from downtown. That is in the Beachview section of town. It's short, but it's a 37% grade.
Okay. We're going to do a show coming up pretty quickly on San Francisco. By the time we do that show, I'll have looked up to see how it compares with the steepest street in San Francisco, which is not Lombard Street, as it turns out. That's just the better known one. No. But There is a steeper street in San Francisco, but not a touristy street. And then we mentioned one famous rich person, John D. Rockefeller, but the other one we didn't mention who is very closely tied to Pittsburgh would be Andrew Carnegie.
Andrew Carnegie, yes.
Yeah, who founds basically Pittsburgh Steel, later U.S. Steel. We mentioned him a little bit in the riots and the trying to quell those.
There are many, many more things I could say about those guys. Andrew Carnegie has left the history of the Carnegie Science Center, the Natural History Museum and Art Museum are both Carnegie, which I did not have time to get into.
There's a university there with his name on it too, as I recall.
Carnegie Mellon University as well, which is next to the University of Pittsburgh campus.
Well, and quite a few of the cities in the U.S. have Carnegie libraries. So that's something that has come up in a number of different episodes. So strikebreaker, robber baron, but in the end spends his money in some interesting ways.
Yes, actually, I heard something yesterday of all things about him yesterday. He left all this money for the libraries.
Right.
But a lot of them are in disrepair now. He didn't leave a fund for the maintenance.
No, it was mostly for construction. Yeah.
Yes, and they're struggling with that right now. That's something that came up in conversation with somebody that's affiliated with one of the libraries yesterday.
Yeah, I could believe that. Excellent. You're standing in the prettiest spot in Pittsburgh. Where are you standing and what are you looking at?
I think I'm standing on Mount Washington looking down at dusk. Okay.
On a summer day or a fall day or?
Most definitely a summer day. I'm a summer kind of guy.
Okay.
So most definitely for me on a summer day, possibly even the 4th of July when the fireworks are going off.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Okay.
It's crazy crowd-wise.
One thing that makes you laugh and say only in Pittsburgh.
The Pittsburghese accent. And another thing, Pittsburgh lefts.
Pittsburgh lefts.
That I say only in Pittsburgh, and I'm from here, is if you stopped at a stoplight and there's a person in front of you turning left with their left blinker on, and the light turns green, they're going.
Okay.
But, these are lights without arrows.
Okay.
That's Pittsburgh left. You just know that person's going.
Huh.
But people from out of town have a lot of trouble with that. They're not.
Would have trouble with that, yes, as well. And then if you had to summarize Pittsburgh in just 3 words, what 3 words would you use, Tom?
I think I would use surprising, post-industrial.
Ah, okay. That's a good definition there because I think it does deal with the fact that a lot of us still have the wrong picture of Pittsburgh in our head. Excellent.
It has changed.
Our guest again has been Tom Shaner. Tom, thanks so much, first of all, for pitching me your hometown or your home city or close by the region there, and for coming on Amateur Traveler and sharing with us your love for Pittsburgh.
All right. Thanks for having me, Chris.
Before we get to our news of the community, 3 quick updates since we recorded this show. One is Pittsburgh, doesn't have the most bridges of any city in the world. It looks like it comes in 4th after Hamburg, Germany with 2,300, Amsterdam with 1,281, New York City with 788. That one surprised me. And then Pittsburgh with 446. It does, however, have the steepest street of any city in the U.S., steeper by at least 4 degrees than San Francisco, which seems like a bad idea since San Francisco doesn't get snow and ice. We also recommended you go see the man with the icy cart, and appears that he has died. I put a link to his obituary in the show notes, so not sure if anybody has taken over the cart. With that, let's get into the news of the community. I do want to remind you that after this episode comes out and before the next one, I will be on a trip with some of you in the Central Europe. I bring that up because you don't want to miss out on next year's trip, which is to South Africa, Botswana, and Victoria Falls. You can find information about that at amateurtraveler.com/Africa 2019. And then probably after I get back from Central Europe, we'll start talking about the trip for 2020. So join the Facebook group amateurtraveler.com/trips to be part of that conversation. With that, we're going to end this episode of Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. And thanks so much for listening.
Got to see one more cathedral. Got to sit in one more cafe.